Relevant sections of Indian Evidence Act. Sections such as Order 19, Rules 1, 2, and 3, and the Code of CRPC, Sections 295 and 297, they are the provisions related to affidavits. Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about meaning of facts. Section 133 of the Indian Evidence Act, which says that an accomplice shall be a competent witness against an accused person. Section 118, Section 121, and Section 133 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the capacity of witness. Section 75 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the private documents definition. Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the definition of the code. Section 11 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the plea of alibi, which is admissible as evidence. Section 17 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the definition of admission. Section 25 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the confessions made to police officers are generally not admissible unless they lead to the discovery of new fact. Section 32(1) of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the admissibility of a dying declaration. Section 32 subsection 1 tells us about the admissibility of dying declaration. Section 52 of the Indian Evidence Act, in civil cases, evidence of a person's character is not relevant. Section 53 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about that in criminal cases, the evidence of previous good character is relevant. Section 55 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us the character of the person who is ought to receive the amount of damages is relevant. Section 91 to 100 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the provisions relating to best evidence rule. Section 74 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the definition of a public document. Section 154 of the Indian Evidence Act allows a party to question their own witness if such witness is found to be hostile. Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us the definition of the term proved, disproved, and not proved. Section 65B tells the recognition of electronic records as documentary evidence and makes the e-signatures admissible in court. Section 67A, it considers the attachment of digital signature to an e-contract as enough proof for consent. Section 137 of the Indian Evidence Act tells us about the examination in chief. Section 138 of the Indian Evidence Act deals with the cross-examination and re-examination of witness. Chapter 7 of the Indian Evidence Act 101, a person is bound to prove the existence of any fact. It is said that the burden of proof lies on that person. Section 4 of the Indian Evidence Act says meaning of the may presume and shall presume. Section 115 to Section 117 deals with the doctrine of estoppel. Section 164 of the Criminal Procedure Code allows a confession made during police investigation to be recorded by a magistrate, which can then be admissible in court to the extent permitted by the Indian Evidence Act. Section 301, which is exception of one of the IPC, culpable homicide is not murder. If the offender, who is deprived of the power of self-control by grave and sudden provocation, causes the death of the person who gave the provocation or causes the death of any other person by mistake or accident. Section 45 of the Indian Evidence Act, it tells about the testimony of the expert is considered a relevant piece of evidence under Section 45 of the Indian Evidence Act, but it is not conclusive proof. Section 30 of the Indian Evidence Act says court may take into consideration the confession of one accused person against another jointly accused of the same crime. However, this does not mean that the confession is conclusive evidence against the co-accused. Section 24 of the Indian Evidence Act is a confession made by an accused person is admissible if it is made voluntarily and is relevant to the matter in question. So these were few important questions related to the Indian Evidence Act.